Night Country, the 4th season of True Detective, just ended, and that's obviously the perfect excuse to talk about one of my favorite characters and how he's not an anti-hero, he's actually a villain, ? I don't know, you'll just have to wait and see. No, it's not that. But there were several connections between Night Country and the 1st season that were most likely just to make us all smile, and smile I did. The Spiral shows up in the 1st episode of the series, and the man that Rose follows out onto the ice is Travis Cole, supposedly Rust Cole's dad. And that got me thinking, why do we love Rust so much?
Rust.
Spoilers for season 1 and a few details from 4, but none of the details, you know what I'm saying. Rustin the Taxman Cole has become one of the most beloved characters in modern TV, and despite the fact that Matthew McConaughey is stupid hot in the show, yes, you know I mean that with and without the mustache and ponytail, his cool, good-looking cheekbones are not why we love him. Or like not the only reason we love him. There are reasons we as viewers are drawn to an anti-hero. Walter White, Tony Soprano, pretty much all the adults on Ozark. We love complicated, seemingly awful people who somehow almost always come out on top until they don't. We love them so much that culturally we sometimes miss the point that they're really sacks of garbage and think of them as actual heroes. And that's where our guy Rust comes in, because Rust is not an anti-hero. He's a hero. A flawed one, for sure, but still a bona fide hero. See, you didn't have to wait too long. Now look, sometimes I throw a word around and people get angry because they think they know what that word means better than me.
I said, Nate, you shut the f*** up.
So let's start with the basics this time. The Cambridge Dictionary defines an anti-hero as the central character in a play, book, or movie who does not have traditionally heroic qualities, such as courage, and is admired instead for what society generally considers to be a weakness of their character. Merriam-Webster uses fewer words, but basically says the same thing with a protagonist or notable figure who is conspicuously lacking in heroic qualities. While these are the technical definitions, culturally we seem to also use the word for somewhat likable protagonists who are, by society's terms, villains. That's where I'd say your Walter Whites, your Tony Sopranos, and all but one of the cast of Friends fit. No, you're thinking of the wrong one. But here's the thing, Rust Cole fits neither of those definitions. He does a few illegal things throughout the show, but the most ethically dubious thing he really does, in my opinion, is have sex with his partner's wife. And yeah, that was crappy, but it was considerably more complicated than those 5 words would leave us to believe. But the thing is, even without that, Rust feels like an anti-hero. And that's for one reason, pessimism. Rust Cole is famously a pessimist, not in a Lee can't stop bringing up the future water wars at your 3-year-old's party kind of way, or even in a Liz Danvers seems like a real Debbie Downer kind of way, in a penetrating philosophical way. And yes, I promise not to use the word penetrating again in this video. And we're going to talk about it, but this video isn't about Rust's philosophy, it's about how he, as a well-written character, enacts his philosophy, thereby giving the audience the feeling of cheering for someone who is almost bad. It feels naughty, as does using the word naughty. Add that to the list of words I don't want to use anymore. Almost bad is cool. I mean, not in real life. Just be good, don't be almost bad. It sucks and it makes people feel unsafe around you, but in movies and TV, almost bad is enticing. Other than crossing the line with Maggie, Rust also beats a suspect, he kicks the snot out of 2 guys trying to get the location of the bunny ranch, he covers up his partner executing Remy Ledoux. These are not good things, and he does all these things as a cop. Regardless of your feelings about law enforcement in general, the concept of enforcing the law does not legally recuse you from that law.
I didn't know Audrey's dad's a cop. I didn't mean no disrespect.
But literally nobody cares that Rust does any of that. Seriously, we don't give a crap. And that's because the core bad guys in the show are some of the evilest people we can imagine doing evil things to children, which triggers my lizard brain, and I think we want them all dead. So regardless of what Rust does, as long as it's not as heinous as that, he's gonna seem like the good guy. When Rust decides to go back undercover and do drugs with his old racist motorcycle gang, he does some incredibly questionable things. However, he goes out of his way to try and make sure he keeps children in that situation as safe as they can be, given the circumstances. So, when compared to the antagonists, and even his own partner, his illegal actions are barely noticeable. In the world of True Detective, he's practically a saint.
This place is like somebody's memory of a town, and the memory's fading.
Stop saying shit like that.
Ah, Marty, the Bert to Rust's Ernie. And by societal standards, Marty is doing life right on the surface. Whether Marty is actually more screwed up than Rust is debatable, but he's definitely not the picture of the American dream that he pretends, and he doesn't even know it. As Rust says,
I know who I am.
Marty doesn't know who he is, or at least isn't willing to admit who he is to himself and his wife. Rust is a relatively open book if you ask him questions. An over-the-top and pretentious book at times, but an open one nonetheless. Marty's personal philosophy is more aligned with what might be considered conventional societal norms and expectations, and while he's got a more traditional moral code, his actions are often hypocritical. He frequently engages in questionable behavior despite his outward appearance of being a family man and upstanding cop. Marty's real issue lies in his inability to confront his own flaws and reconcile his actions with his moral beliefs. He is insecure, violent, angry, and impulsive. One of the primary ways Marty demonstrates hypocrisy is through his treatment of women. Plenty has been said about Season 1's less than glowing portrayal of women in general, but despite presenting himself as a devoted husband and father, he cheats on Maggie a bunch, does the tired-ass interrogation thing of grilling his daughter about her counterculture clothing, and eventually hits her. All of this is the complete opposite of Rust. In all honesty, Marty might be more of an anti-hero than Rust, but Marty sucks. So we don't talk about how cool Marty is because he sucks. Don't get me wrong, Woody Harrelson is awesome and a great actor and clearly brought a lot to the character. Who sucks? And there are plenty of things I actually like about Marty, but Marty juxtaposed with Rust makes us like Rust more.
I'd consider myself a realist, all right, but in philosophical terms, I'm what's called a pessimist.
That word understandably can confuse folks. We use pessimism as a catch-all for any time somebody thinks something will go bad, won't work out, or is screwed from the jump. And that's correct, but that's not necessarily philosophical pessimism. And here's the thing I think you might be thinking right now as I'm diving into pessimism, because I've also thought it. You've seen the show, you know how it ends, and it takes most of the season for us to really get to know Rust. But we learn that his daughter died, he buried himself in his work, which unfortunately was going undercover doing lots of brain-breaking drugs, and eventually his wife left. If that won't give you a bit of a negative outlook on life, I'm not sure what would. I think we can look at Rust's pessimism as the result of searching for meaning after he lost it all. I bring this up because, yes, I agree that Rust is a man going through decades of grief and pain, but none of it undoes the beliefs he puts out there to Marty or why those beliefs make him seem so dang cool to us.
The real answer is that it's obviously my programming.
I do want to be clear that Rust has his own version of pessimism. While some of his lines could be easily interchanged with some pessimistic writers, just because he calls himself one and is played by a famous and handsome famous person who's handsome, doesn't mean his interpretation of pessimism, or even my interpretation of his interpretation, is the correct one. As I mentioned, we're being very deliberate with our definitions today, so to be clear, this is my understanding of pessimism and its surrounding philosophies, as well as my understanding of Rust's understanding.
It's a circle.
With me? You know, and while we're at it, without going into things I'm absolutely not an expert on, pessimism is different from nihilism. It might be fair to say that nihilism can be a gateway drug of sorts to pessimism and vice versa. It kind of depends where you land. Where nihilism focuses on the idea that life lacks meaning or value, pessimism tends to focus on the negative aspects of life itself. They both have an overall gloomy perception, so the assumption is that people who are nihilists or pessimists automatically must hate life and care about nothing, which again can be true, but it's definitely not the rule. Nick Pizzolatto himself, the creator of the show, has recently come out against the idea that Rust is a nihilist because, well, let's just let him use his own words. Because, far from nothing meaning anything to Cole, if anything, the world seemed overwrought with meaning to Cole. And for a nihilist, he sure does care about doing the right thing and serving justice. Thing is, that's not mutually exclusive with nihilism or pessimism. For plenty of people, nihilism can lead to a sense of liberation or freedom from the constraints of traditional beliefs and values. It can also lead to feelings of emptiness or existential dread. Pessimism, on the other hand, can cause an acceptance of life's hardships or a determination to find meaning and fulfillment despite the apparent futility of existence. After all, liking things is more fun than not liking things, right? Even if the things are the utter pointlessness of life. See, it's not insane for the optimism guy to talk about pessimism. But philosophical pessimism is a worldview that does have a fundamentally negative outlook on life. Based on the works of philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer, Emile Cioran, and to a lesser extent Friedrich Nietzsche, pessimism challenges the assumptions about human progress and the possibility of achieving lasting happiness. Rust oozes there is no happiness, only pain, and to be frank, the entire first season and show has that vibe, which is why it's interesting that Pizzolatto said what he said. Even their success at the end of season 1 is a tiny victory. They still barely know what Carcosa is. I don't believe it's this actual physical location. And they didn't stop the cults or hold any of them accountable beyond a few. And that's pessimism. It suggests that life is inherently filled with struggle and disappointment, and that efforts to find meaning or purpose are pointless in the face of inevitable suffering and mortality. Thomas Ligotti, renowned for his unsettling and philosophical horror writing centered on the bleakness of existence and the futility of human endeavors, was famously a big influence on the character of Rust Cole. One of Ligotti's key influences on Rust is the pervasive sense of cosmic horror and existential dread. And if you immediately think Cthulhu when you hear the words cosmic horror, that's thanks to well, H.P. Lovecraft, but Ligotti really liked him too. Ligotti's fiction often explores themes of cosmic indifference, where humanity is portrayed as insignificant in the vast and uncaring universe. Cole grapples with a profound sense of nihilism, viewing human existence as fundamentally meaningless and devoid of any inherent purpose. And this perspective is evident in Cole's pessimistic, and if we're being honest, a little over-the-top monologues where he reflects on the futility of human endeavors.
Transference of fear and self-loathing to an authoritarian vessel. He absorbs their dread with his narrative. He's effective in proportion to the amount of certainty he can project.
No, hey, Shea Wiggum, by the way, he's really good in this. But Ligotti's look into the fragile nature of sanity and the breakdown of the human psyche is clearly connected to Rust. Throughout Season 1, Rust struggles with the psychological toll of his investigations into the darkest aspects of human nature. His experiences lead him to question his own sanity, and the nature of reality is similar to Ligotti's exploration of the thin veil between sanity and madness, which is very relatable. As someone who watched live, this show made a lot of folks start thinking some big thoughts. Anyway, Cole adopts philosophical pessimism as well as a cynical and nihilistic perspective, viewing human civilization as a fleeting and insignificant blip in the vastness of time and space. This existential outlook permeates his interactions with others and informs his bleak worldview, echoing Ligotti's belief in the inherent absurdity and futility of existence. Fun, right? I agree.
Means I'm bad at parties.
Let me tell you, you ain't great outside of parties either.
Maybe not fun at parties, but this is a big reason why we think Rust is so cool. Due to pessimism's outlook on existence itself, it's often connected to anti-natalism, which is one place nihilism and pessimism can lead people, the idea that it might be better to have never been born.
Brothers and sisters opting out of a raw deal.
In short, Rust mentions that we shouldn't exist and that the best thing humanity can do is stop having babies and just let ourselves go extinct.
Stop reproducing. Walk hand in hand into extinction.
It's dark, especially because it's not particularly focused on anything specific, like the human impact on the planet or overpopulation. The way Rust presents it, it's as though Bob Ross made an oopsie and should just cover us up with some pretty trees.
Sooner or later, you'd have a third one. You know how them little rascals are. You gotta watch them.
We can't know for sure if Rust is truly an anti-natalist. It fits very well into the idea that to prevent suffering, which for him is losing his entire family, we should just not exist. What exists can't hurt me if I don't. That's the line, right? But he does have a handle on the philosophy, and it's not something he's just mentioning to sound edgy. Of that, I'm sure. Pessimism seems scary. A lot of Western culture isn't prepared to talk about whether or not existence is good. I'm not even sure I want to have that conversation. But the fact that Rust talks about this stuff makes him seem like a scary dude. And his character's interpretation of pessimism being openly influenced by a horror writer, who mostly writes about the awful curse of existence, makes him a different type of dark character. He's not just a hero fighting against bad guys, he's fighting against the very idea that existence is inherently a good thing, while simultaneously fighting to save actual human lives. It's immensely engaging, and it's why he's such a good character. And I came down hard on Marty earlier. There's good reason to, but I'd be lying if I didn't acknowledge that Marty was also a massive reason why Rust is so likable. Their relationship in general is possibly my favorite thing about the show. I think Rust's philosophy is based off his lived experiences, and I'm not here to knock any IRL pessimists. But when your coworker starts talking about tasting ash or that a town is more like a memory of a town, Marty's eye rolling makes a lot of sense. The way they hate each other, but deep down love each other, is no better showcased than in the final scenes of the show.
Are you watching me sleep?
Well, you know what? I just got here. I was gonna leave, but then you woke up. Jesus, what's your f***ing problem?
Nothing. What's your problem?
Not a care in the world.
It's like they both need to get their pokes out of the way before they can treat each other like humans. I don't aspire to this kind of relationship, again, just be nice. But I fully appreciate that it works for them. And I wouldn't blame anyone who rolls their eyes with Marty on second, third, fourth watches because Rust is insufferable. But because of his unique philosophy, it doesn't come off as weird, annoying, or quirky on the first couple watches. It's just Rust Cole, badass who's handsome, very handsome. One other thing I think is worth mentioning is the actual final scene. Because I think it would be easy to say, see, Rust lets go of his pessimism. And if that's your takeaway, that's totally fine. You may be right. Rust has a near-death experience that leads him to believe that his daughter's love is still there.
I can still feel her love there.
I love that. It's beautiful, and the scene moves me to tears.
Nothing but that love.
But it doesn't mean he's changed his philosophy. If pessimism says nothing matters, doesn't his ending monologue imply love matters? Yes, and love can matter. Love can be the meaning inside an existence that is still ultimately meaningless on the grand scheme. It was enough to keep Rust from taking that final step he talked about back in the first episode.
I'm not supposed to be here.
Maybe Rust walks off into the sunset with Marty and starts singing show tunes.
You know, you're looking at her on the sky thing. Well, once there was only dark. Let me ask, any lights went in?
That's beautiful, and I, again, love it to pieces. I love that it's the last line of the season. But something tells me that Rust is left right where our story is left. He isn't the type of guy to ignore that the light wouldn't have anything to compete with if the dark didn't exist. He's talking about the stars and space, but the obvious implication is that the good guys are winning. But good guys like him, indeed, heroes like him, only have to exist because of humanity's depravity and the suffering it causes. There's no feasible way to ignore that Marty and Rust cut off the equivalent of a pinky toe, maybe a hand with regard to the Tuttle cult. By the way, read The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers if you want to hear where a lot of that cult stuff came from, but they may have well plucked a hair when considering the grand scheme of evil things happening even just in their world. Still, Rust has purpose for his life, and he's found some meaning in the meaningless, even if he'd still most likely agree that human sentience was a mistake. In the end, Rust is just a hero, which is great, we love heroes. His adherence to his personal philosophy makes him a more ethical person than most of the characters in the show, and despite the fact that one could view his pessimist, nihilist, and anti-natalist beliefs as harmful, his way of putting them into practice actually saves people and helps the greater good.
Shut it!
He comes back to a case that was closed, willing to undo his own work to stop the actual bad guys. That's hero behavior. He also stops a lot of future murders by getting confessions. The show and the narrative and the vibe are always telling us that he's got this dark underbelly.
Some police can do terrible things to people with impunity.
But even this moment and that line are about his outlook on cops, not a threat. Granted, treating sex workers like humans and not taking advantage of them is pretty much the bare minimum requirement of being a decent person and not exactly a hero caliber act. But in the True Detective world, it's admirable nonetheless. And one thing I'd forgotten is that the entire season is teasing us with the idea that Rust might be the real killer after all. And it's not impossible for us to believe, again, because we know what he thinks. It can be easy to fall into the thinking that a philosophy that makes you personally feel weirded out is bad and means they might be hiding evil secrets. But it's just not the case. That's not to say somebody who's a pessimist can't be a pile of garbage. Chiron, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche all had some heinous views throughout their lives. In the show, Duvall very casually calls out Rust's darkness, says he has a demon and a shadow. Reggie also has a sense about Rust that he'd seen him in his dreams in Carcosa. Even Errol seems to speak to Rust like he knows him. But what we know about these three should make us realize they're probably sensing Rust's goodness, since he's the one that will undo them. Like a dog who knows they shouldn't trust someone. But like, it's an evil dog. But yeah, man, you guys shouldn't trust Rust. And as Marty shows us, having a traditional Western philosophy living the American dream doesn't automatically make you a good person either. Marty could have found a way to have his worldview, his faith guide him to being a better person. He didn't. Rust did. He's not Superman, but he's also not Walter White. He's Rust Cole, and he's very handsome. All video I've been talking about primarily one thing, and it's the main thing that has always stood out about True Detective, the writing. And if Rust and Marty's complicated journey to find justice makes you want to write your own moody mystery opus but you have no idea where to start, why not check out today's sponsor, Skillshare? Whether you want to write a pilot, a screenplay, or even like the creator of True Detective, write a novel before you dabble in TV, Skillshare's got you covered. Maybe you've got a main character with an atypical worldview or philosophy. Well, guess what? Skillshare has a philosophy for beginners class, so you don't have to get in arguments with people online about whether or not your character actually is an absurdist, a rationalist, or randomly, off the top of my head, a pessimist? And one of, if not the primary aspects of my job is writing, and I'm planning on doing a few more essay-style videos like this one this year, and I want to make sure I put out the best and most interesting content possible. That's why I was stoked to take the class Writing for Expression, How to Make Your Words More Artful and Lyrical with the incredible writer and poet Hanifa Durakib. He helped me experiment with poetic language and then combine that with structure in a way I hadn't tried before. And if you don't already know Skillshare, they're the largest online learning community for creatives. They've got an absurd amount of classes led by actual pros in film, illustration, design, freelance, and honestly so much more. Writing is a big part of what I do, but if you've been with me from the beginning, you know I also learned editing in Premiere through Skillshare. So why not kickstart your creative pursuits or career? And don't worry if you don't know where to start, Skillshare's learning paths are hand-picked classes that you take in order, thereby building skills on one another and reinforcing what you've learned. Whether you're a beginner or advanced in a field, they've got a variety of experience levels to meet you where you are. And right now, the first 500 people to use my link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. A whole month of learning for free? Talk about a cinema win! So thanks for checking out my sponsor. It's a huge help to me, and I also promise to never promote something I don't use myself and love, and that's Skillshare. Thanks.